I would say that Canada is not only frozen in the climate, but frozen in the intellectual climate as well. There's a very bad climate in Canada now in terms of not being able to speak about things without being ridiculed and deplatformed, as I was recently at a conference which was happening in Regina. After you've dealt with all of the reasonably scientifically defensible things, if you want to remain adversarial, you have to invent new things which aren't really quite so real. So what I say is Greenpeace abandoned science and logic and adopted sensationalism, misinformation, and fear as their primary fundraising tools. At the time life came on the land 400 million years ago or so, the CO2 was still up at 3,000 to 4,000 ppm. Today it's at 410 and everybody thinks it's too high. It is actually, the truth is that in this Pleistocene ice age, which is only 2.6 million years old, which is a blink in geological time, CO2 has sunk to the lowest levels it's ever been in the history of life on Earth, which is somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years. So this is the lowest it's ever been. We have restored a balance to the global carbon cycle, which was continuously declining for at least the last 500 million years.
Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussain, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. Is the world facing a climate crisis? There is an insistence that we are, and a determined effort to shut down debate. The science is settled, we are told, by non-scientists. But the science is never settled. That is its nature. The scientific mind always questions. Indeed, there are many issues which are actively being suppressed and not discussed. Goalposts are constantly shifting, while the terminology switches between global warming and climate change. In the meanwhile, quick, achievable solutions to the so-called carbon emission problem, such as the use of nuclear power, are not being considered or embarked upon. Was the environmental movement always like this? If not, how and why did it change? And what can we do to bring back sense and rationality to the discussion? I am pleased to discuss these issues today on my podcast with Dr. Patrick Moore. Dr. Patrick Moore has been a leader in the international environment field for over 30 years. He's a founding member of Greenpeace and served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as a director of Greenpeace International. As the leader of many campaigns, Dr. Moore was a driving force shaping policy and direction while Greenpeace became the world's largest environmental activist organization. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Kirk. It's very nice to be with you from Baja, Mexico to Trinidad and Tobago.
Oh, that's great. I was going to ask. So is it Baja California they call it?
Yes, they call it, well, it means Lower California.
Yeah.
And then there's just Baja, which is the upper half of the Baja Peninsula, both of which are part of Mexico. and then, well, this is actually Baja California Sur, Baja California South,
yeah,
where I am, and we're just inside the tropics. So we're both in the tropics today.
Okay, great, great. And you're doing research there, are you?
No, I've had a home here for 20 years in order to escape the frigid winters of Canada, where the climate hasn't changed enough yet.
Right, right. And discourse is probably freer there in Mexico than Canada right now, isn't it?
Yes, I would say that Canada is not only frozen in the climate, but frozen in the intellectual climate as well. There's a very bad climate in Canada now in terms of not being able to speak about things without being ridiculed and deplatformed, as I was recently at a conference which was happening in Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan, which is in the center of Canada, in the farming area. And the city of Regina has planned a conference called Reimagine Regina, where their goal is to make the city of Regina, which is about 500,000 people, to make it 100% renewable. And of course, I would come to that conference and argue that 100% renewable is not an attainable goal. And why would you say that anyway? Does that mean you can't have steel, concrete, plastic, or asphalt to pave the roads? Because they are non-renewable. Does it mean you can't heat your buildings with natural gas? Because it is non-renewable. Does it mean that fossil fuels will be banned inside the city limits? I don't think these are very realistic goals. And I really believe if we're going to work towards sustainability, that we need to set realistic goals. And you mentioned in your introduction, why aren't people then willing to have nuclear energy as an alternative to coal for electricity production? There's 450 nuclear power plants operating in this world today. And it has turned out to be the safest of all electric technologies when it comes to the amount of energy produced compared to the number of casualties that have occurred. You know, in oil and gas, things blow up all the time and kill people. In hydroelectric even, which is a wonderful source of renewable energy, dams burst and people die. In Russia, for example, just not too many years after the Chernobyl disaster, which killed 56 people, that is the World Health Organization's estimate, more than 60 people died in a single hydroelectric accident in Russia. And those deaths at Chernobyl are the only civilian deaths from nuclear energy in the entire history of the nuclear energy industry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of well-meaning people who are sort of caught up in this terminology and they don't understand really what they're talking about. And then people like yourself who are, you know, presenting knowledge and facts and you know, going against what they're taught as the right thing. It's this weird sort of, you know, it's a sense of heresy. That's what it is. It's absolutely. This is a religious movement, and you're a heretic, and you must be burned at the stake. That's basically kind of what it is, and it's really weird how we've gotten to this stage. What's your response on that?
Well, it's quite a calamity, I believe, intellectually, scientifically, historically. We entered the Enlightenment many hundreds of years ago. I suppose Galileo would be a good marking point for when people started thinking that we should accept the science as something different from religion. In religion, it's okay to have invisible things. In science, observation is the first priority. If you see something happening and then you try again and see if you can make it happen the same way, cause and effect. Seeing is believing, and seeing it over and over again under circumstances reinforces the belief. And this is when you develop a hypothesis. You say, I believe that it's quite possible that this is causing this. And so you replicate it yourself over and over to make sure you're right. And then you offer it to other scientists to replicate it too. Because if it's just you, you can't expect the whole world to just trust one person say something. So if the other people are able to replicate what you have done and to say to the world, yes, we believe this is true, that is science. And one of the biggest problems today, and this was the subject I was going to give my talk in Regina. Of course, now I have arranged to have my own venue in Regina, and it is attracting a great deal of ticket sales because people are now intrigued that the city has deplatformed me and doesn't want to hear what I have to say. This is going to be a very interesting event. It's on May the 19th, evening of May the 19th in Regina. I will be speaking. And in the first day, we've sold over 600 tickets.
and the original venue, how many people were they expecting in the original venue?
I'm sure we've surpassed them already because their conference costs $300 and there's 45 speakers, no doubt half of whom will be extremely boring.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to be derisive, but it's hard for me not to be after they've deplatformed me. Mm-hmm. And so I realized, and I can't believe I didn't realize this earlier. I did have a term called the invisible poisons, in which I was referring to the concern for pesticide residues in food, etc. Something you can't see that they're telling you is going to give you cancer or autism or obesity or whatever,
Yeah.
but you can't see it. So how can you verify that it's even there? Yeah. And now I realize I've made my title of this talk, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Mm-hmm. I know it sounds sensational, but when you see the presentation, you'll realize that it's not. Yeah. Because it's true that nearly all the scare stories that go around the world today, and I'll go through some of them with you, they are all about things that are either invisible, like carbon dioxide. Yeah. You can't point over to the mountain and say, look what the CO2 is doing over there, because you can't see it or taste it or smell it or touch it. Yeah. And so that's an invisible factor, and it's being said to be responsible for a myriad of problems. Yeah. I saw one tweet the other day in which there was one panel in which it said, pigs are getting skinnier because of climate change. And then in the other panel, it said, horses are getting fatter because of climate change. Exactly. And this is the ridiculous level to which it has sunk in many cases. Yeah. But I mean, on the other hand, they're saying the world is going to come to an end in 10 years because of CO2. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I definitely, the science education apparently is lacking, because the whole point that you were just talking about, the scientific method, which everybody who's had a high school education knows that it's observation and hypothesis and testing, and it's just that's what we learned in school. And then later on, even like Karl Popper's idea of what a scientific hypothesis is, which means it's falsifiable, so that if you make a prediction, and if you're wrong, your theory is wrong, and then you change it. But as you said, if the pigs get skinnier, you're right. If the horses get fatter, you're right. If it's too cold today, you're right. If it's too hot today, you're right. There's no way to disprove, these articles of faith. It's amazing.
This is right, and yeah. Go on. Even things though which are visible are often remote, so remote that no one can observe them and verify them. The same thing. Yeah. So they might as well be invisible. And this goes like polar bears in the Arctic. How many people fly up there can go around the whole Arctic and count the polar bears? And some things are both invisible and remote. Things which are underwater are basically invisible, even though they're not invisible when you go underwater. How many people go underwater? Not very many. Yeah. But they are also, the coral reefs, for example, are underwater, and they are quite remote for most people. So they are in the same category. And so the title, Invisible Fake Catastrophes, Catastrophes are things that are said to be happening at the moment. The climate emergency, for example.
Yeah.
Threats of doom are predictions for the future, such as half the species will go extinct. They can't say half the species are going extinct now because they aren't.
Yeah.
But they're saying they will, definitely, in 20 or 30 years. If the temperature goes up by half a degree Celsius globally, half the species will die. They're actually saying that.
Yeah.
So it's become so ridiculous. I have to make a ridiculous title to my talk in order to,
absolutely
make sense.
I remember the first IPCC, I think it was IPCC conference or the Paris talks or whatever. Okay, so they're talking about all the difficulties in I guess controlling the environment, but then they made a commitment to reduce the global temperature by 2 degrees. And I was wondering, where's the global thermostat to do that? I don't understand. They can't predict the weather, next week, but it's as if there's a simultaneous arrogance in this thing. First of all, that we have so much power over the natural environment, and 2, that we can control it so precisely by our action. It's ignorance as well. It's ignorance and arrogance, and a total out of touch, sense of natural processes. And I can't believe that this is done at such a high level. I mean, now you've been involved in this movement for so long. You're an environmental scientist and activist from Greenpeace. I don't know. Tell me, how did it reach from where it was to here? Because I don't think it was always like this.
No, it certainly wasn't always like this. When we began, the word ecology had only just begun to be printed in the newspapers. Before that, no one even knew what the word was. And at the time, I was doing my PhD in ecology because I immediately realized that is where I wanted to go. Because ecology is really about the relationships among all things on the earth and even in the heavens, but let's restrict it to the earth and the sun for a moment. That's what ecology is about, the interrelationships among all the different components of the earth and the oceans and and all of life. So I was fascinated by that because I'd been brought up in a rather secular household. We didn't talk about spirituality or religion at the dinner table. And there was no church in my little village because it was only 100 people. So I grew up that way, thinking that religion was just sort of not real.
Yeah. Can you where was that? Where was it you grew up?
Winter Harbor is on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the full-blown rainforest, temperate rainforest, and there was no road to the village. My village was floating. It was built on logs, and it was so you could move it from one place to another to do the forestry along the shoreline of the inlet. Protected.
Is it an old town? Or is it new? Or I'm just curious. There was no church there. Usually with a small town, the first thing is a church for the community. So it's interesting that this village you grew up in. I'm just fascinated by what you're saying.
The native people had lived there for over 5,000 years. When Europeans came, the smallpox and measles epidemic destroyed their numbers by 90%. And the village I grew up in was where they had originally had a village, but they had all gone to Central Place, the bigger village. And so it was abandoned. So my father rented from the native people, from the First Nations, as we call them in Canada, rented this piece of property, which was the best piece of property because that's where they built their village after 5,000 years. They figured out where the best place was. And so I grew up there. But initially we were on a floating village. And that's so you could move it around with about 60 buildings, each one on its own separate float, all tied together in a string and then tied to the beach. So you could untie it from the beach and individually move all these floats to a new place. And that's how I grew up. And when the road came to this little village of 100 people, we thought it would expand and grow. Half the people used the road to get out. So learned something about human nature that
That's
day.
right.
But anyway, I found myself at the University of British Columbia doing a PhD in ecology in my early 20s. And I heard about this little group named the Don't Make a Wave Committee that was meeting in the Unitarian Church basement in Vancouver to plan a protest voyage against US hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. And I was very much an anti-war person.
What year was this?
We were becoming hippies in these days, in 1971.
Okay.
And so I decided to join this group, and we became Greenpeace. And I spent the next 15 years with them. But at that time, it was the height of the Cold War, the very height of the Cold War, the height of the Vietnam War, and of the threat of all-out nuclear war. And it was also the beginning of the emerging awareness of the environment.
Right.
So all these things combined turned me into a radical, I guess you could call me a born-again ecologist.
Right.
And so I marched out into the world on this and went on this voyage to Alaska. And miraculously, President Nixon took into account the opposition, not just from us. We were kind of the tip of the spear going out in the ocean towards the nuclear tests. But other people were marching in the streets by the tens of thousands in Canada and the United States. And President Nixon canceled those hydrogen bomb tests after that one.
Right.
So, and that was also the beginning of the strategic arms limitation talks between the Soviet Union and the United States to reduce the number of nuclear missiles. So it was the very peak of the Cold War, from when the threat was increasing till when the threat was reducing. And we just happened to act at that time and create a tremendous energy to move forward. And so the Amchitka Island hydrogen bomb tests in Alaska, we weren't the only actors in that. We were just, as I say, the tip of the spear. But when it came to the next...
I just as an aside, sorry, I mean, you mentioned that isn't it amazing that the SALT Treaty has now been torn up, basically? I mean, so you would have seen it from the beginning. You would have been, and now, I mean, it's amazing how the world is turning and reversing. But sorry, it's just, I mean, you brought that up, and I think it's important to see how so many of the things which you were there at the birth of, it's kind of reversing now. And it's not just it's on so many levels. But sorry to interrupt. Go on.
Oh, is it ever on so many levels, Kirk? You're so right about that. Then we decided, and a few of us, most people went back to their normal lives after the campaign against U.S. testing. A few of us said, we've got something here. Let's continue. And so we decided next to take on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific, a lot further away from where we were than Alaska was. But the French had not assigned the underground test ban treaty, the treaty to, go underground. So by this time, United Kingdom and Russia and United States were all testing their nuclear weapons underground, but France was still testing them in the atmosphere in French Polynesia. And because France controlled the media, the French people didn't even really know this was happening.
Yeah.
And so we sailed a boat from New Zealand to Mururoa Atoll, where the nuclear tests were going, 2 years in a row, and we drove them underground. And you can give Greenpeace the full credit for that, because I was there. We lobbied the United Nations. We went to the UN conference in Stockholm in 1972, which was the first international environmental conference.
Right.
And we lobbied the Southern Hemisphere countries to put a resolution on the floor, which was very much opposed by the nuclear powers, to condemn French atmospheric nuclear testing. And it passed by an overwhelming majority. And that was the beginning of the end.
Let me ask you, so Green was, when you guys formed I guess it was, you called it Greenpeace, right? When you were formed, that was the first name and it stuck.
No,
No.
no, the first name was the Don't Make a Wave Committee.
Right. Okay.
And the Don't Make a Wave Committee, which I became a member of, decided to rename the boat we had hired. It was a private boat, a fish boat, named the Phyllis Cormack after the captain, John Cormack's wife. But we decided to rename the boat the Greenpeace, because one of our members in a meeting, as we said goodbye to each other, quite often you'd go peace to say goodbye.
Yeah.
And he said, why don't we make it a Greenpeace?
Yeah.
Just like that. And that's how it was originated.
So you guys really started it from scratch, the name and everything. So it was started there. I didn't realize it was, I thought it was like a chapter or something, but you were there at the founding. Okay. So.
Well, I also stayed on longer than any of the other original people.
Right.
I was 15 years. First, I became the head of Greenpeace, the original group in Vancouver. And then when we had an internal legal struggle over the control of the word Greenpeace, it's a long story, but we ended up having to sue our own San Francisco group that we had created, because they were trying to take our name and all the US fundraising potential away from us.
Yeah, and I've heard people, saying that you are making a false claim about your involvement. I mean, this might have been a while back, but I saw it on YouTube and just checking out some of your backstory. And yeah, and so people were saying that you were never really involved in Greenpeace, or it just seemed totally absurd. Was that part of this process you're talking about?
Yes, Greenpeace now describes me as an early member who played a minor role in the early years.
Right.
But I was 15 years a director of Greenpeace and was responsible actually by suing the San Francisco office and settling out of court to create Greenpeace International. I was the head of the founding organization at that time.
Yeah.
And they're saying that because I wasn't the very first person in a living room to discuss the concept of sending a boat to Alaska, that I only joined after the committee had been created, right. That therefore I wasn't in the founding group. But the proof in the pudding is that, and I have Wayback Machine screenshots where you can go back in people's websites and look at what they said before.
Yeah.
Every single Greenpeace website, including Greenpeace International, up until February 2007, which was 20 years after I left Greenpeace,
yeah,
had my name in the list of founders. I've got the screenshots.
Yeah.
I show them to Wikipedia and they don't care. They listen to Greenpeace. But because Google and all those Silicon Valley types are very biased. And now when you Google my name, right up towards the top are always the hate sites, which are calling me a climate denier and all this sort of stuff, and basically trying to cancel me.
There's a similar thing. I interviewed Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. I don't know if you know him, but he's the inventor of email. He did it when he was 17 years old in New Jersey. He's an Indian immigrant, and he made it up. And then later on, what is it? ARPANET. They deny him, any credit going to him for. He made up the name email, the whole file system, everything. But they want to make it part of the sort of military-industrial complex thing, and they go through Wikipedia to edit his name out of history and all sorts of stuff like that. Very similar to your story there. Yeah, amazing.
Well, so then we created Greenpeace International, and I became one of 6 directors representing the Canadian organization. That was the arrangement we made, and if we hadn't settled that, Greenpeace would have split up into a bunch of fragments, all calling themselves Greenpeace.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the way they've gone, abandoning science and logic altogether, in my estimation, I almost wish I'd let it go.
Yeah.
But
I remember the 1980s because I was involved in all that kind of stuff in the 80s. I was in Canada at the time too. I grown up in Canada, and there was a kind of there were like 2 Greenpeaces. One had like an anarchy symbol, and they were like more militant, direct action type, and I think there was supposed to be an official Greenpeace. Was this part of the splintering you're talking about?
No, I wouldn't describe it like that.
Okay.
It was just a civil war.
Yeah.
And you know, in those days, question authority was a big slogan.
Yeah.
People had buttons that said question authority. And so our founding group in Vancouver was looked upon as having illegitimate authority over these other Greenpeace groups that had sprung up mostly through our doing, but some of them spontaneously. And then we recognized them and worked with them, but they wanted to be autonomous.
Yes.
In other words, they wanted to take all our history and photographs and videos of the exploits we had made and raise money with it.
Right.
So we said no. And that's how Greenpeace International was created. Basically a negotiation between David McTaggart, also a Canadian, who had founded the Greenpeace European organization with our permission. But he wanted control. He was a Machiavellian character. He's passed on now, but somewhat Machiavellian character, political control. And so he gained the chairmanship of Greenpeace International as a result of this negotiation, where I was able to be less controlling, even though I was the head of the original group. I was willing to compromise in order to get this thing whole, so it wouldn't be fractious and in a civil war, because we were wasting half our energy on infighting instead of doing what we should be doing, which is saving the world.
I'll tell you what I remember, like in the 80s, and I mean, when I was a child in the 70s too, you know, you'd see pictures of like, I think it was Greenpeace, like Greenpeace ships going and preventing, you know, I guess military or whaling or these types of things. So it had this kind of direct action appeal to it. And I'm just thinking about the environmental activists of today who are claiming the mantle of what you started. And I guess they would say they're doing the same thing that you guys are doing, you know, demanding action of leaders, you know. So you said you went to Stockholm and, you know, we're influencing governments on nuclear testing and stuff. So they, in their minds, they're seeing themselves as doing the exact same thing that you guys are doing. So, but, you know, I've heard them say, well, now you're on the side of industry. And, you know, I guess, I don't know if it's the nuclear industry or whatever, but you know, they take the attacks ad hominem, you know, to your person and your personal interest. But so maybe there is that direct action activist similarity, but underneath, where does that difference come? Because I don't know, it wasn't necessary. It didn't have the doomsday atmosphere. That, I mean, it was activist, it was anti-war, it was all that, but there is something different now, and I'm trying to figure out how and when and why that change happened.
We had a slogan: the revolution should be a celebration. We sang a lot. We had parties and enjoyed ourselves. Today, it's like the hair shirts, you know. It's almost like self-flagellation is the correct way to have a change of society and to impoverish everybody. That's not how we were in those days. The difference is, though, the threat of nuclear war was real.
Yes.
The threat of climate change is imaginary.
Yeah.
And so if you are fighting for something that is just and true, it's different for fighting for something you've made up and sensationalized.
Right.
And most of the, you know, we more or less tackled all the serious things.
Yeah.
We tackled nuclear war and nuclear weapons testing. We tackled the slaughter of 30,000 whales a year in the oceans. We tackled the toxic waste issue into the air and the water. The rivers of Europe and Britain were dead even in the 70s. And they'd passed Clean Water Acts in the US and Canada, but over there was no fish in the rivers. They were just pouring their industrial waste into them. Yeah. And that changed because of us. But after you've dealt with all of the reasonably scientifically defensible things, if you want to remain adversarial, you have to invent new things which aren't really quite so real. So what I say is Greenpeace abandoned science and logic and adopted sensationalism, misinformation, and fear as their primary fundraising tools. And that's the way it is today. There's not many things I agree with them on these days because I don't think they're correct about what they're saying.
Yeah.
For example, let's go back to the fake invisible catastrophes and threats of doom. They're saying the polar bear is endangered with extinction because of climate change. They've been saying it for 25 or 30 years, over and over and over again. I was in an audience of 500 well-educated Canadians the other day, and I asked, how many of you know about the treaty that was signed by all the polar nations ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears in 1973? And these are mostly older people.
Yeah.
And not one person had ever heard of it. Now, wouldn't you think that the media covering polar bears might mention it once in a while?
Exactly.
Because there is such a treaty, and it has been well enforced. And the population of polar bears, the official number then was in 73 was 6,000 to 8,000 is all that remained, because they were being indiscriminately hunted for rugs and wall hangings. And so today it is estimated, the average estimate is 39,000 polar bears. It's gone from 6,000 to 39,000. There may be as many as 55,000. This is the official estimate. The Polar Bear Science Group recognizes it. The World Wildlife Fund recognizes it. But on the World Wildlife Fund's webpage, it says, oh, yes, but over the next 20 to 30 years, the polar bear population will decline by 30% because of climate change. They have no clue that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And just for example, they act as though the more ice there is in the Arctic Ocean, the more polar bears there will be, like as if that's their habitat. And during the feeding season in the winter, when the seals come up on the ice to breed, that is when the polar bears get fat. But if there was ice on the whole of the Arctic Ocean, how would plankton grow in the sea? And if plankton didn't grow, how would fish grow? And if fish didn't grow, how would seals grow? And if there were no seals, how would there be any polar bears?
Yeah.
So it's not true that the whole Arctic should be covered in ice for a maximum number of bears. There's a balance point where you have open sea for much of the year. And the open sea actually is apparently creating more polar bears. Well, ending the hunting has been a big part of it too. But there is no problem with polar bears, zero. Yeah. And even the Inuit people who've lived up there for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and even today live there year round, unlike almost anybody else, they say now there are too many polar bears. It's a report has been tabled with the Nunavut Inuit Council in Iqaluit on Baffin Island, that's their capital there, saying there's too many polar bears, and they've given it to the federal government, and the federal government just ignores it. Because the federal government's position is there's a threat to polar bears. Yeah. And they actually, I don't know why they believe that when the people who live there are telling them. They say there's too many polar bears, they're eating our people, they're breaking into our houses. Yeah. You know, and so I'm not saying there's too many polar bears. But they are having a lot of problem bears. And yet down south, everybody thinks there's going to be no more polar bears. Yeah. And the same thing with the coral reefs. There was a headline in 2016, April, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is dead or dying or about to die, depending on the headline. Mm-hmm. And you look in there and for one thing, you can never find the origin of the number 93. This 93%. It's true that especially the northern section of the Great Barrier Reef during this El Nino warm period where the oceans are warmer had some excessive bleaching in that time. But bleaching is not death, and yet the media makes it seem like it is. Yeah. It's not like the term bleaching is a metaphor. When you bleach clothes with chlorine to make them white and get the dirt out, we all know that bleach is a very strong toxic to bacteria, for example, disinfectant. So when you mention the term bleaching, it's easy to associate that with dying.
Yeah.
But that isn't dying. The corals almost always recover after they eject their plankton, which are what makes them colorful. So they turn white because they're made of calcium carbonate. And the animals that are the coral animal is transparent. They're a relative of the jellyfish. So they don't give it any color. So the only color is the white of the calcium carbonate, the shell that they've created. But when they bring the plankton back in again, and they select the whole colony of any coral selects exactly the same species of plankton, each one. So you can have the same species of plankton, a red one here and a green one here, because they've taken in different species of plankton. It's very complicated. But anyways, they made people think that the Great Barrier Reef was virtually dead. And then the next year, they used the word terminal. Now we're certain the reef is terminal. And then only 1.5 years later, they said, amazing, the coral reef is making a miraculous recovery. But that story didn't go very far. The first story about the 93% dead coral reef went around the world to every media outlet there is.
That's right.
But when the story came out that the reef is recovering, which they always do, our little village here in Baja has the largest coral reef on the west coast of the Americas in front of it, because we're on an east coast in the Sea of Cortez.
Right.
And so like in the Caribbean, you're protected from the westerly wind here.
Yeah.
And there's a coral reef growing right behind my back is a large coral reef out in the sea here.
Yeah, I mean, pointing to those facts are very important, because I remember, I mean, I was an environmentalist, from the 80s, from when I was a teenager and stuff, environmental consciousness. And I remember the campaigns, because I was living in the Toronto area, like acid rain was a big thing. And that was solved, basically. I remember the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone layer. And so then chlorofluorocarbons CFCs were taken away from the aerosol cans. And I think that's more or less been not an issue. At least people don't talk about it anymore. But I remember, there are practical, there'd be, about pollution into the rivers and industrial waste. And so, so industry was the enemy. There were measurable targets. You passed legislation. It was achieved, and that was it. But now, you have this sort of vague notions, and the biggest industries in the world are pushing this, global warming thing, and nobody's talking about pollution anymore. It really is this shift, and I think from what you're saying, that's a very interesting thesis, that basically, the major problems have kind of been solved, and they're kind of making up new problems. Am I understanding you right, that that's basically the explanation?
They never run out of ideas for making up new problems. And the fact is, I'll just talk about carbon dioxide for a minute, Kirk.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, so go on.
Carbon dioxide is the basis of all life on Earth. It is where all the carbon in all the carbon-based life, which is all the life, comes from. And this is in both the air and the sea. So on the land and in the air, it's carbon dioxide, which is used to make all the plants. And in the sea, it's the carbon. Could you
clarify this for me? I mean, I remember in studying chemistry that the very definition of an organic compound was whether it had carbon in it. So therefore, carbon is life itself. Am I right in that understanding?
Of course you are. And that is the funny thing about that is fossil fuels are organic in the scientific meaning of the word organic,
yeah,
because they're all carbon based, because they're all of life origin. And the carbon in the fossil fuels all came from the atmosphere and from the oceans. You see, the oil and gas were mostly made in marine sediments, whereas the coal was all made with with trees, basically, with forests that were somehow sank into the sediments and turned into coal. Because you can even see the tree rings in some of the coal even today. And so it's very obvious that coal came from plants. And it's very obvious that oil and gas came from plankton and other marine species that fell to the bottom of the sea. And so we know for sure that all of that carbon that is in the fossil fuels came from the atmosphere when the atmosphere had a far higher level of carbon dioxide than it does today. And in fact, at the time that modern life emerged, which was called the Cambrian explosion, when multicellular life first occurred, about 570 million years ago, at the end of the pre-Cambrian period, which was about 3 billion years, where life was microscopic, unicellular, and confined to the sea. There was no life on the land until even later than this. It was in the sea that the Cambrian explosion occurred. At that time, CO2 was at least 10 and probably as much as 15 times higher in the global atmosphere than it is today. And life came into a flourishing at that time. And then the life came on the land. At the time life came on the land 400 million years ago or so, the CO2 was still up at 3,000 to 4,000 ppm. Today it's at 410 and everybody thinks it's too high. It is actually, the truth is that in this Pleistocene ice age, which is only 2.6 million years old, which is a blink in geological time, CO2 has sunk to the lowest levels it's ever been in the history of life on Earth, which is somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years. So this is the lowest it's ever been. We have restored a balance to the global carbon cycle, which was continuously declining for at least the last 500 million years.
So let me get the figures. Let me get your figures right. So you're saying at the beginning of the Cambrian period, which is with the explosion of life, of contemporary life, I suppose, it was 3,000 to 4,000 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and now it's just 410 parts per million. Is that correct?
Yes, but at the peak of the last glaciation, which was only 20,000 years ago, when the seas got colder and absorbed a lot of the CO2 in the atmosphere, it went down to 180 parts per million, which is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. Plants cannot survive below 150 ppm.
Yeah.
And so
this is so important because people are talking about carbon emissions and all this as if it's bad when carbon is life. But and they don't even know how many parts per million is in the atmosphere. They probably don't even, I've never heard people, use figures like this. So now I remember in one of your interviews that I've seen before, you talked about a greenhouse, that when people are, growing plants in a greenhouse, putting optimal, conditions for plant life, the first thing they do is put more carbon dioxide in the greenhouse. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, well, first, as you mentioned, they're always talking about carbon as if we're emitting carbon. Yeah. Carbon and carbon dioxide are two quite different things. And the reason they say carbon is they want you to think soot.
Yes.
They want you to think about black, dirty soot, right? And then they show steam coming out of a smokestack backlit by the sun so it looks black, and say, this is the carbon emissions, right? They're very tricky this way.
Yeah.
But so carbon dioxide is at its lowest, was at its lowest in the history of the Earth 20,000 years ago. But when the oceans warmed coming out of the last glaciation, the oceans gave off CO2 to the atmosphere and brought it up to 280 ppm before industrialization. And we've taken it, I believe we're responsible for the vast majority of the increase from 280 to 410 now.
Okay. And
this has resulted in a greening of the Earth of significant proportions. And this is not contested. That even NASA has come out clearly showing 10, 20, 30% increase in biomass over large areas of the Earth as a result of CO2 fertilization. Whereas the temperature of the Earth has only increased by 1 degree Celsius since 1700, which was the peak of the Little Ice Age when it was much colder.
Yeah.
But only 1 degree on average. So if we didn't have thermometers, we would not know that the climate had warmed over the last 100 years.
That's
we would
right.
we couldn't detect it. Like the amount that the climate has warmed, you only have to move from, say, New York to Washington, D.C. to get an even bigger change of average temperature than the whole planet is going through now. So when they say that the temperature is accelerating rapidly, it's simply not true. It's actually very slow. And so CO2 was threatening to become so low because of the depletion. Now the cause of the depletion is something that really nobody is learning about, and that is the calcifying marine species of life, ranging from plankton, little wee coccolithophores, foraminifera, which are animals. Coccolithophores are plants. They do photosynthesis. They have calcareous shells, and so do clams and mussels and barnacles and oysters and crabs and shrimp and coral reefs. They all learned nearly 500 million years ago to control the crystallization of calcium and carbon dioxide forming calcium carbonate, which we call limestone, when it's deposited in the Earth's crust. All the limestone in the Earth's crust is of life origin. All the carbon in that limestone is of life origin, and it all came from the sea as carbon dioxide, and it all got in the sea from the atmosphere, from volcanic eruptions earlier in the life of the Earth when it was hotter and there was more volcanism. That's how the CO2 got into the atmosphere in the first place. But it is continually declining because all of these creatures in the sea learned how to make armor plating for themselves out of limestone. And they did it inadvertently, in the same way that we have inadvertently, by putting some of the CO2 back into the atmosphere, by burning fossil fuels and making cement from limestone. About 10% of our CO2 emissions are from cement production. Using the limestone that are the shells of those creatures that sank to the bottom of the ocean. And so we have restored a balance to the global carbon cycle and have saved life. We're not its destroyer, we are its salvation, because it was going to be depleted to levels that would have resulted in the death of most of the life on Earth over the next few million years.
Wow. Let me ask you something about the greening, because I remember the reports coming in from last year talking about, and India and China were very much responsible for a lot of the greening as well. I remember in the 80s, the big thing that they were talking about was deforestation of the Amazon, and that was the Earth's lungs, and we would lose, we would, I don't know what would happen if we lose the Amazon. There'd be no breathable air. I'm not sure what doom they were preventing, but it was supposed to be bad. And obviously, deforestation, it does have bad effects. But so how does that, because I remember that prediction, did that come true or not? How does that square with what we're observing now with the increased foliage? Could you sort of shed light on that? So at least I, in my mind, could tie up, was our concern in the 80s real? Have we fixed it, or what?
Well, the lungs of the Earth is a fake metaphor. You could, not that I'm recommending it, but you could burn every living thing on the Earth and it would hardly change the level of oxygen in the atmosphere at all.
Right.
That oxygen in the atmosphere is actually represented by all of the sediments and all of the carbon that has been pulled out of the atmosphere and the oceans. It was the plants who put the oxygen in the air.
Right.
And so the oxygen in the air is not threatened at this point in time. There's nothing we could do to harm the level of oxygen in the air, but we are able to affect the level of CO2 in the air. Oxygen is almost 20% of the atmosphere, right, but CO2 is 0.04% right now, well, 0.041%.
Yeah. In
other words, 0.04%.
Yeah.
And it's really, really low.
Mm-hmm.
And it was as much as 0.4 to 0.6%. Isn't it amazing that plants can live with their main food on something that is only 0.04%, actually down to 0.015, which is 150 parts per million.
Yeah.
0.015% is where plants finally can't get enough CO2 to survive. Right. And that's where it was heading. And so all of this fantasy about, and deforestation, I mean, so people should recognize that all our agricultural fields represent deforestation. It's not like as if it's done for evil purposes. It's done to grow our food.
Yeah.
And that's why intensive agricultural practices, in other words, using technology, genetics, and chemistry to increase the productivity of the land, means that less nature will have to be destroyed in order to produce our food. And that's another thing they don't understand and refuse to get through their brain. It's the same as intensive forestry. If you want more natural forests to exist, you should be growing more wood per hectare on the areas where you're growing wood. But last time I looked, if you wanted wood, you had to cut trees down in order to get it. So, there's so many basic things that are not being understood by people these days.
Yeah.
That it's enough to drive you a bit crazy. I'd like to talk about critical thinking.
Sure.
Critical thinking is the real problem with the educational system now. It's not so much the subject matter as it is being able to discern what's right and what's wrong, or what's fake and what's not. The first lesson in critical thinking for me is to remember that anytime you see a headline or a first sentence or paragraph with the words may, might, or could in it, you should always read it over again and say may or may not, might or might not, could or could not. Because when you just say may, it seems like there's a distinct possibility that this is going to happen, because it is a prediction.
Yeah.
And you should say might or might not happen.
Yeah. And
then you've got a more balanced understanding. So never believe a sentence that starts or a headline that has those words in it, just if they have just may, might, or might not. I saw a headline said, Africa's oldest baobab trees are dying and climate change may be the reason, right? Well, there may be a lot of other reasons too.
Exactly.
And so that's the first rule in critical thinking. And the other rule is just to look for what the assumptions are, because very often a scare story will just assume that CO2 is bad.
Yeah.
It's just bad.
Yeah.
It's poisonous. It's toxic. It's pollution. They call it pollution all the time now.
Yeah. It's
when in
incredible.
fact it is the main food for life. How can you call an ear of corn pollution? Can you call
exactly.
a bowl of soup pollution?
I mean, humans breathe out carbon dioxide all the time. So that means, I think it's purposeful. So they're making us seem as if we are parasites on the earth, that we are pollutants, that our very existence is a burden to the environment. That's their worldview.
Yes, it is. But did you realize that when you exhale, your breath is 40,000 ppm carbon dioxide?
Oh, really?
40,000.
And
remember how there's this story that if you talk plants, it'll make them grow better?
Yeah.
You're breathing 40,000 ppm of their main food onto them when you're talking to them. Mm-hmm. That's why they grow better to them. So you don't really have to talk. You can just breathe on them.
There was a point you were talking about, and you mentioned Africa and stuff, and this is something I think is very important, and critical thinking. With this new Green Deal that's being pushed in the United States in particular, and then I guess in other places in Europe as well, they're kind of pushing it. But really, and when we were talking about the Amazon and growing food, and this is so important, because coming from someone who, I live in the third world, and I'm concerned, and I've always, even when I lived in first world countries, I was concerned about global development and development in the third world. These environmental agendas by people living in urban areas who are so alienated from nature, they think something in a box is organic, and shipped thousands of miles, and I just find it laughable. They are looking to basically halt development in places like Brazil or in Africa, in the poorest places of the world, in the name of the environment, while they're on their iPhones and whatever, using all these rare earths, and it's, I just find it, it's extremely aggravating, hypocritical, arrogant. What's your view of the Green New Deal? I mean, I do see it as it's almost like it's a genocide policy. It's anti-development for the third world. But that's coming from my perspective. I'd like to hear from your perspective. How do you view this?
It is a recipe for mass death and murder. If you stopped fossil fuels, let's say you stop them quickly, because there really is no substitute for the 85% of the energy that they provide us. Even nuclear can't do the transportation thing with heavy transportation and heavy machinery. And speaking of heavy machinery, there's a thing called agriculture.
Yeah.
And if you stopped fossil fuels now, agriculture would die. And if agriculture dies, there's no food, or not enough food, that's for sure. It's getting up to 8 billion people needing food every day. How would the trucks get the food into the city even if there was food? Because you're not going to have a solar-powered truck, not packing 40,000 pounds of food. So the food wouldn't get into the centers of the city. So the death would begin in the center of the 500 cities over 1 million people, where there's no possibility of finding food. So all of a sudden, people would be dying in the streets, and other people who were about to starve to death would be like 1 billion lifeboats at sea, where you have to start eating the other people.
Yeah.
And you're kind enough to let them die first. Maybe you wouldn't be so kind enough to let them die if you felt you could kill them right away, right? So that's what would happen to the majority of human beings in the world. The ones who were left, scraping a living somehow out in the real world where the dirt is and you can grow something, they would cut down every tree in the world within a very short time, because that would be the main source of fuel that was available.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be anything else. You couldn't burn coal, you couldn't burn gas, you couldn't burn oil, so you have to use wood.
Well, that sounds like Haiti, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what it would be like, only on a global scale.
Yeah.
The reason Haiti doesn't have any forests is because they don't build their houses with wood.
Right.
If they would use termite-treated, resistant wood for their houses, they wouldn't have lost 250,000 people in an earthquake that was 20 times less severe than the one in Japan.
Oh, Japan.
In Japan, that was Richter 9. The one was 7.5 in Haiti, and 250,000 people died because substandard concrete fell on their heads from the buildings they make out of not enough rebar and poor quality cement. If they built their houses of wood, they would have to grow trees. If they grew trees, they would have forests, and then they could live in a house that wouldn't fall on their head in an earthquake.
I'm so sorry. I know you have to go, and we need to cut the interview short right now. So I just want to thank you, not only for this interview, but for all your work and your determination, your intelligence, and your commitment. I wish you all the best and every success in your struggles ahead. Thank you for leading the way.
Thank you very much, Kirk, and I'd be very happy to come on with you again anytime.
I very much look forward to it. Thanks very much. Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.